In this video, we are going to talk about events and state. So right now, our application is fairly static. It doesn't do a whole lot. We just have some straight up HTML being rendered to the page, or straight up HTML elements being rendered to the page. It's not particularly interesting. So we need to start to understand how we can react to events and how React can come in and start merging our updated shadow DOMs to the page. So the idea is every single component has two things. It has state and props. Props, we see an example of a prop right here, a property. Props, what they do is they represent the data that's been passed down to them by the parent component. They're data that has been shunted into the child, right? Just like HTML attributes. State is something that's owned by every single full class component. Every single component that uses the class syntax and extends react.component or uses react.createClass has a state. And the state is nothing more than a bag of properties. It's just an object. That's it. It's nothing fancy or special or magical, except that it's recognized by React. Now, if the props or the state of any component changes due to an event or any other circumstance, what React will do is it'll re-render that component and all of its components' children, and then merge the newly updated shadow DOM into the physical DOM. So that's why it's very important that our render methods are as quick as possible, because every time something changes in our app, anything from changing the color of something, to receiving data from a web service, to displaying a card in a game, changing your hand, literally everything that causes a change in our DOM, well, not literally everything, but almost everything through React, will cause a re-render. And there are performance tips that I can give you, and we'll explore them when we build the larger applications, for telling React, okay, in this case, I don't want you to re-render everything, I just want you to re-render this small bit. But generally speaking, you can think of any change to props, any change to state will result in a component re-render. And a component re-render, again, is React invoking this render method, receiving a new copy of the shadow DOM, and then merging it into the physical DOM. So let's talk about state. So state is a very special property that's available on our object, on our component. And by default, it's going to be null. But we want to start off with some sort of default values for our state. And what the values that we put into our state are is dependent on the component. So like a comment box might have state for, or a list of comments might have state for data that was retrieved by a server, for example. And that component will then own that state. And if that state changes, then it will re-render. But we need to be able to set up defaults for our state. And we do that by providing a constructor. Okay, so the constructor, if you're not familiar with constructors, that's basically the function that's called when this class is instantiated and turned into an object. I covered that in using modern JavaScript today. And because we extend from another class, we must invoke the super constructor, which is the constructor of the class above it, in this case react.component, somewhere in the constructor. Otherwise, we'll get an error. If I comment that out, see, ESLint doesn't like that. However, this constructor isn't quite done. Whenever you create a constructor for a React component, now we're not going to talk about this. We're going to talk about props in the next example. We're not going to talk about props here. Too much, anyway. But I want to instill this right now, even if you don't know what you're doing. Always accept a parameter. Now, the parameter can be called whatever you want, but generally speaking, it should be called props. And always pass that first parameter into the super constructor. So anytime you have a class, you have a component that extends from react.component, and you make a constructor on it, you should always accept a parameter and pass that parameter along to the super constructor. But anyway, so now that we have a constructor, again, this method will be called once when the app component is instantiated. By the way, the app component isn't instantiated right here. It's instantiated when React DOM actually goes in and does its rendering stuff. Like I can do, app component for days here, and that's not going to result in the constructor being invoked ever. So that's important to understand. But anyway, we want to set up our state with default value. So this is actually slightly different than how we would set the default state for a component created with the react.create class method. But in this case, we simply do this.state equals and then an object. In this case, we're going to do a count of 5, and how about a title of hello world? We're not going to change the title, but I just wanted to show a state with more properties than one. So now we have the state object. This is the only place in a React component where you should ever set the state to something. We will see how we modify the state later when we talk about handling events. But for now, just remember, the only place where we actually set the state to an object is in the constructor of the component. But already we can use the React developer tools to take a look. So let's come over here and open up React and click on our app component, and notice that it picked up on the state that we set. In fact, we can even change the state if we wanted to. Doesn't like, there we go. So we can use the React developer tools to play around with the state and the props, is basically what I'm showing. If I click trace React updates and I change the state, watch what happens on the left-hand side when I hit enter. I don't know if the FPS of the screen will show that box, but every time I change the state, render is re-invoked and it re-renders the entire element. So how do we use the state? Well, in order to know how to use the state, we first have to talk about the expressions. Inside of JSX, we can pass in JavaScript code. But we do so by using curly braces. So I can say header, and I'll do a colon, and then I'll open up curly braces. So this is a standard template syntax that you'll see in everything from Angular to handlebars. And I can pass in just arbitrary JavaScript expressions. Hit Control S, come back over here, and we see the result of that JavaScript expression. So that's that's basically the gist of it. We're going to see a million different ways we can create JavaScript expressions within React. It takes a little bit of time to get used to, so I encourage people to type this stuff out. And because we'll be seeing so many examples of this in our project later in this course, I'm not going to dwell too much on it, other than to say, open up with curlies, and you can pass in arbitrary JavaScript. And that JavaScript will then be rendered as a placeholder to wherever those curlies appeared. But let's go ahead and write out information from the state. So I'm going to say const count title equals this.state. So I'm using the deconstructing syntax here, object deconstructing syntax, in order to extract the count and the title property out of the this.state property. And the syntax is covered in using modern JavaScript today. It's standard ES 2015 syntax that I will be using quite frequently. So now I can say header, I'll do colon, but instead of a math expression, I'll pass in title. And then on the p tag, I'm going to say the counter is colon, and I'm going to pass in count, wrapped inside of curlies. So if I come over here, header is hello world, and the counter is 5. I'm actually going to put an exclamation point at the end of both of these, and you'll see why in a moment. So if we go ahead and inspect this, in the React inspector, we'll see that the H1 now has 3 text nodes underneath it. Header colon, hello world, and exclamation point. So the hello world is the bit that was extracted, just like 5, that was the template bit that came out of our state, the variable. But in this case, you see how it's split into different text nodes. And if we actually inspect it in the real DOM Explorer, we will see that represented as well with these comments saying this is the string literal, this is the variable, and then this is a string literal. And also, I encourage people to do this when they're learning JSX that might be confusing. Always remember, you can hop over into Babel, and you can see what it turns it into for the react.create element. So notice how the react.create element of the h1, which corresponds to this code right here, is passing in h1 for the element type, null for the properties, and then for the children, it's passing in a string, a variable, and a string. And then internally, React will it won't concatenate them all. It'll create text nodes, which it'll then add as a child element to the h1 element. All right, next up, events. So we're going to be talking about events, but first, before we do that, let's talk about events. I don't know why I said that. Let's hop over into the documentation. So head over to the docs. I highly encourage you are aware of this event system and this event system page. We're going to talk about what synthetic events are momentarily. I'm not too concerned about those right now. And event pooling, blah, blah, don't care. What you should be aware of when dealing with events in JSX, in React, is that React only recognizes a certain amount of events. Certain amount of events that are named in very specific ways is how React knows that this is an event and not a normal attribute. You can attach custom events to elements, but it requires getting a reference to that DOM element that was created, which we'll see examples of later in this series. But in general, these events will cover almost everything. So these are the event names that you can use. We have our clipboard, our composition, our keyboard events, like on key down, on key press, blah, blah, blah. Form events, on change, on input, on submit. Mouse events, particularly we're interested in on click. And selection events, touch events, UI events, wheel events, media events, image, animation, transition. So we see all the events that React understands. And you have to be aware that if you use JSX to add an event to an element, it has to be one of those events that React already knows how to understand. So let's go ahead and create a couple buttons and attach events to them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create two functions. I'm going to do increment, which will do console log inc, and decrement, which will do console log dec. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a div. And then I'm going to create two buttons, one with the plus. Actually, let's do the minus first. And one with the plus. Now, as of right now, these buttons do absolutely nothing. They will render into our DOM, of course, as you can see right here. But they don't do anything yet. So how do we do that? How do we handle events? Well, basically, you would just add one of those events that's supported by React as an attribute or as a prop to this element. So what I can do is I can say on click, and then instead of passing in a string, so this is the interesting thing, where HTML, whenever you pass in an attribute to an HTML element, it has to be a string, right? Like there's no other way. HTML has no concept of any other data structure other than a string, any other data type, any other value. But as you might suspect, you can pass in arbitrary things by using the curly brace syntax instead of using quotes. So what I can do here for this on click is I can actually pass in a reference to a function. And this reference to a function, it doesn't get turned into a string. Let's go ahead and do both of these. So the second one will have on click equals this dot increment. And let's go ahead and take a look at Babel real fast. Blah, blah, blah. Pull this up. You'll see that these buttons, React.create element. Remember, first parameter is the element. Second parameter are the properties. Third parameter is the content. And, well, third to x, however many parameters you want. So as you see right here, we're passing in this dot decrement literally, not as a string. If instead of curlies I used quotes, notice how now onClick is being set to the string this dot decrement. Well, the string this dot decrement isn't a function, and this code would probably error out. So we want to make sure we use curlies instead, which will pass it in as a literal object. And you're not limited to just passing in strings and functions. You can pass in fully fledged objects. You can pass in arrays. You can pass in other components in weird circumstances. You can pass in variables, whatever you want when you use the curly brace syntax. But anyway, so let's go ahead and see if this works. Come over here. We should already be refreshed. And it does. Our inc and dec work. But there's a problem. And you might already have an idea what that problem is. If you use if you've used react.create class before, you might not immediately see the issue. But if you have a kind of an idea about how the this keyword works, you might be able to suspect where I'm going with this. And what I'm going to say is, basically, the this inside of increment, but when invoked by the button, is null. As in, we've lost a reference to the this variable, to our component. And we're not able to mutate it at all. Now, there's a couple solutions to this. First of all, I didn't point this out before, but I'll point it out now. You can pass in anonymous functions to this if you want. Or if you wanted to maintain the this variable, you can pass in an arrow function. If I passed in an arrow function that did this.increment or this.decrement, the this would be preserved because the arrow function will capture the this in the static scope and bind the resulting anonymous function to this. But there's a couple of reasons why you might not want to do that. And one of them is performance. Every time your state or props on a component change, remember, props are what the parent send to the children, the data that gets flowed through the hierarchy, and state is data that each individual component can hold on to. If either the props or the state changes, there will be a whole new re-render cycle, meaning this render method will be invoked again if anything changes, if any data changes, if your counter changes, if your color changes, if anything changes, render will be invoked again. So you don't want to do anything that might damage performance. And one of those things that might damage performance, and you see a lot of people do this in JavaScript code because they might not know better, is creating closures, creating new functions. So this actually will create a closure every time the render function is invoked. Now, one closure isn't going to make a single ounce of difference for performance, but it can add up. And it's a bad habit to get into, to constantly create new closures every time the render function is invoked. It's something you should do very, very sparingly, if at all. So, how do we fix this? Well, if you've seen my So You Think You Know JavaScript course, where we go into great detail about what this is, what this means. And if you're very confused about what this is and the dynamic versus lexical scoping, then I highly recommend you check that course out. But if you're familiar with the course or you're familiar with the content in the course, you would think, okay, we could do this.decrement bind this. And this would be the proper solution. So, well, not the proper solution. This would be a potential solution. So now in the increment, I can say console log this, come over here and hit increment. And now I have an actual reference to my actual instance of my actual component. But this is also going to suffer from potential performance issues. And that is because every time we call .bind, we are creating a whole new function again. So it's basically no better than just creating a closure. Actually, I haven't looked at any micro benchmarks comparing using .bind compared to creating a closure, but I just would hazard a guess and say that they have similar performance characteristics. The point I'm trying to make is, while this is the solution, you shouldn't do the binding here. So I'm going to show you guys something that if you are not so familiar with the dynamic nature of JavaScript and you're more familiar with, let's say, C# or Java or C++, I'm going to do something that's going to probably freak you out. Up here at the top, in the constructor, I'm going to say this.increment equals this.increment.bind this. This decrement equals this decrement bind this. So what I'm actually doing is one time, when this component is created at the creation time of this component, I am binding these two functions, these two methods, to this instance of the object. So I'm preemptively binding it. So no matter who calls increment or decrement, wherever that invocation comes from, no matter the dynamic context, it will always be tied to this particular instance of the app component. And this is the proper solution. Now, there are ways to do this dynamically if you wanted to. Or not dynamically, automatically. If you enable annotations, for example, there are certain annotations that allow you to auto-bind, and there are different libraries where we can wrap classes with other things and stuff like that to do this automatically. I don't really like the concept, unless you use annotations, which are nice, but unfortunately annotations are not quite standard yet. I would recommend binding the methods that you want to bind explicitly. I think that it helps with readability and declaration of intent when you bind them yourself. Anyway, so we're going to wrap this video up. In the next video, we're going to talk more about state. So in this video, we talked about what state is, state and props, how they relate to each other, although we'll see props later. We talked about adding variables into our JSX code and how to handle events. We'll talk more about events and more about state in the next video.